Kempton Park has joined us.
Look at those pretty people.
Yes, I hope the internet will hold. All right, so let's share. Can tell me when you can see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right, so to start off, not all of you on the class tonight have been with us for the previous 4 talks, but that's not too big a problem, because we'll kind of build, even though we're taking a little bit of a different angle, we'll still catch up on some of the things we discussed there that's important for tonight. Right. So the war in Ukraine, we all know by now. If you don't, then I don't know where you've been, but we all know Russia invaded Ukraine. So this map you see there is the latest one. You can get a minute-by-minute update, obviously, of what's happening there. But the areas in pink is where Russia are now occupying those territories. And you can see they're quite close to Kiev. I made my pointer big so you can hopefully see Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. They are close there. They are continuing to bombing cities, especially the city here, Kharkiv or whatever, doesn't matter really. The name is coming under heavy fire right now. And we are 7 days into this war. People thought that Russia would make progress much faster, but it does seem like they're battling a bit. Okay, so for purposes of this talk, you might want to just take note of down here is a small, well, it's like an island almost, but it's the Crimea country that Russia annexed quite a while ago and took repossession of it. And that also has a bearing on whatever's going on there, as we'll discuss briefly now. All right, so we might want to think or share some ideas as to why Putin wants to take back this area here, the Ukraine. As you can see, Kiev, the capital, and the Ukraine, country of Ukraine is down here. Now, there's basically 3 reasons that you'll find most people talk about, and that is the one is his own perspective on history, and that he wants to reunite all these countries that was part of the Soviet Union before. But when Russia collapsed, the Soviet Union kind of lost control of a lot of these countries, and people called it a collapse. A lot of these countries became independent, and then Russia remained, but it was a lot smaller. So he wants to reclaim it so that the Soviet Union that was there before is existing again. You might not know it, but this little city, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was in this area where Russia started in history way back. We're not going to deal with all that. I'm not an expert on it, but it's interesting. And then it was moved to Moscow. So Kiev was actually where Russia started, and apparently Putin's mother is Ukrainian. So you can see he really believes in the ideology of these people are Russians and they broke away, and now the Western world, NATO wants, the Western world wants to bring them over to become Westernized. So he sees himself as that figure that has to prevent this and bring Russia back to its former glory. Let's look at the political and military aspect of this, which is also tied up in history. That is also a reason why you can understand why Putin wants to really take over Ukraine and making all these demands. So in 1991, when Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed, the nations in these countries here in blue, we all know NATO, they are in alliance with each other. they their border was up to here, right? So that is kind of was already close to Russia, if you would say Russia was this part of the Ukraine, like before, the Soviet Union. But at the moment, if you look at these countries, you'll see that if you want to defend your borders, Russia wants to defend its borders like it is now. They would not like NATO to expand. And at the moment, there's been talks and so on, and Ukraine has the option, and there's been talk about Ukraine becoming a NATO nation. That would mean the enemies of Russia would be right on its door step, and much more difficult to defend. So you can understand it. But I want to show you something interesting. So Kiev was originally where Russia originated, and then the capital moves up there to Moscow. Just keep that in mind. And this was all part of the old Soviet Union. But if you know in Germany where the Berlin Wall is, was, then if you look at this area here, it's called the European Plain because it's flat. It's very flat. And in between some mountain range and then the sea here. And when East Berlin was there and the Berlin Wall was there, if anyone wanted, and remember by in that days, this area here was also the Soviet Union. If anyone wanted to come and attack Russia, or even today, it is important to try and stop them here before they filter in here, and then they got this plain that they can easily bring tanks across and just full scale bring in a large army to attack your country. So you can sort of really see why it's military strategic for Russia to not have, especially Ukraine, become a blue NATO nation. Then, you know, they can come, and since the Berlin Wall has fallen, you know, there's this huge gap where Russia becomes much more weaker in defending itself. So that would be, you know, from a historical point of view and a military point of view, and the politics involved here, why Putin will definitely not be very happy and very concerned about the Ukraine making noises about being a NATO nation. The other thing is the economy. And what is important here to know is that Russia is the biggest exporter of gas, and a lot of the energy of Europe comes straight from Russia. And it used to, the pipelines of the gas used to go through Ukraine. But lately, Russia has built other pipelines. So they're not so dependent on Ukraine for getting their gas and things they export through to the European countries. And their economy and their army and their weapons and all those things have been built up because of the lots of money they make by exporting the energy to these countries who needs it. So Ukraine has, in this area here and somewhere here, they have discovered gas, and they, if they would be able to have the resources to develop those gas resources, then they would become the second biggest, just behind Russia, provider of energy, and that would harm Russia's economy immensely. So that's one of the reasons why Russia took over this little country, Crimea. I'm not going to go into the detail, but that and a lot of other things that Putin did prevented Ukraine from developing those gas resources, because they don't have the resource or the money and the funding, and they got you know, they've been kept tied up by all kinds of political stuff from Russia. Now, that is a big deal for Russia. You can understand they don't want Ukraine to ever get into a position where they get a lot of support from other people then to strengthen their economy with the gas. So those are the three things that help us to understand what is going on here. what I hope, does that make sense? Give me just a thumbs up, Liesel, I can see you, so if you can hear and it makes sense. Okay, I'm not a history teacher, but that's enough for us to know for the moment, and we'll leave it there. Okay, so now before we carry on, I would like you to, because this is has a bearing on what's going to follow, I want you all to take out your pen and paper and give me a short, what do you understand by the word Armageddon? In the Bible, that they say Armageddon is going to take place. If you hear that word and people talk about Armageddon, what do you understand about it? If you don't understand anything about it, you can say, then you'll learn something tonight, or maybe not. So you can put it in the chat if you want, or you can put on your speaker and your sound, and mute yourself, and just give me a brief idea. What is your understanding about that term in the Bible that people talk about? When is Armageddon gonna be? Where is it? What is it? Any definitions in the chat? Liesel first. The last battle between good and evil before the day of judgment. Fosterberg's a big battle. Luana Stacy, a great battle. Yes, I'm sure you're right. It's a big battle. So if you say that, you are definitely not going to be wrong. But anybody a bit more detail? Who's in the battle? What's in the battle? Where's the battle? And so on. Anyone wants to give me an idea there? Okay, so out there where Leona is, says the battle after Jesus' return between Jesus and opposers. Fissenberg say they're not too sure. The worldly powers against them.
It's Brother Andrew's negotiation. Brother Andrew's suggestion.
Cool. All right. Okay, so I like all the answers. Definitely all in the right vein. So let's just get a little bit more detail on that, because it's very interesting. So let's just see where I went. Okay, so this word appears in Revelation 16:16. He gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So the Bible makes sure that we go and find out what the Hebrew meaning of this word is. So I've got this from a very good article, but obviously everyone must check these things for themselves. Throughout Scripture, a theme of the final climatic battle is taught. The battle is often referred to as the Battle of Armageddon. Several themes are mentioned throughout Scripture in relation to this battle: the sickle, a harvest, all nations, a valley of judgment. So let's take a look at these themes and a couple more that are relevant. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. There's a traditional view that I want to show you, that this article and the person here, which I agree with, says it's not quite correct, and it's important. The traditional view is that this battle is that fought at the mountain of Megiddo or Megiddon. Unfortunately, there is no mountains or mountain at Megiddo, only a small hill, often called a tell. It gives you references, and it only speaks of a plain of Megiddo, as does Zechariah speaks of those. But there's no mountain. Okay, so some people say this Battle of Armageddon is going to be in the Valley of Megiddo, because there's a valley there, and people will be on some mountains, and armies will gather there and fight. So there's a battle, but here is, if you run through this article quickly, I'm not going to run through all of it, but it just says the word Armageddon is made up of 3 Hebrew words. The first one is Arama, the second one is Gay, and then Don, Armageddon, right? And if you look at the meaning of all those words and where they are in the Bible, you can do the study yourself, or ask me for the link of this, and you go look at all the verses. But basically, this is the bottom line. When all these elements are combined, the word is found to mean a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. Okay, so the symbol there is all these nations are like sheaves. They come together in this valley, and then Jesus comes and fights against them. So notice a lot of people say there's a World War III. World War I and World War II weren't really wars where the whole world was involved, but because so many nations was involved, they called it the world wars. So there's never going to be a World War III where all the nations, like in World War I and World War II, fight each other and so on. The Bible talks about Armageddon, where all the nations in the world, like you all said, is going to fight Jesus when he returns. Okay. Now, next, it talks about all these nations, and it just gives you these verses that shows it's always against Jerusalem, against Jerusalem, against Jerusalem. And the action takes place outside the city of Jerusalem, not 60 miles on from there, where there's near Megiddo, right? And this is important. The Middle East will be the focal point of the Battle of Armageddon in the southern part of Israel, in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. The Valley of Jehoshaphat is also known as the Kidron Valley, and that is just next to Jerusalem. So this kind of makes sense, because when we know when Jesus comes back, he's coming back to the Mount of Olives, he's in Jerusalem, he's going to set up his kingdom there. So you can understand if nations wants to come and fight him, they're going to go there where he is and come down, and God says, I'm going to gather all nations. So why would he's going to gather into Jerusalem, all eyes on Jerusalem, that kind of idea. So that is interesting to note. Okay, so now everybody happy with that? Are we happy that Armageddon is when Jesus returns and he fights enemy nations and defeats them, and then starts his kingdom and reign? Everybody happy with that? Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to show you, thanks for the firsties, give me a thumbs up. I'm going to show you, and that's what I liked about this talk tonight. I had time to once and for all actually feel, I hope so, get it better on visual, how to explain the traditional Christadelphian view, and then show you that there's one element there that I feel we are completely missing the mark, and therefore it has a kind of a important effect on how we must look at these things. Okay, so this is a slide that is taken out of a talk that was given 2 days ago, and it's on the Christadelphian.org YouTube channel. The gentleman he's an excellent speaker, he's got excellent visuals, and he does explain the view, the orthodox or the traditional view of prophecy very well. And so I respect that, but I want to try and show you the differences so that you will know what to look for and just know a little more, and we don't get so overwhelmed when we hear so many things. Because when you just sit down and listen to a talk, the people just go, they give you information, and it all sounds so great. But I'll show you where the weakness, I believe, is. Okay, so just going back here, look what the traditional view does. It says that all these chapters, Zechariah 14, Ezekiel 38, Daniel 11, Joel 3, and Revelation 16, they are all prophecies of that day when Jesus returns to fight the nations, and it's all Armageddon. The gentleman used the slide, and notice here when they look at Ezekiel 38 and Gog, who's Gog and whatever, they list all these nations. By the way, I believe this is in all possibility the most likely scenario that will play out, that these nations here has got Russia in the mix. Okay, but notice on the same slide they put Daniel 2 with the image where we know Jesus definitely comes back to and the stone hits the 2 feet of iron and clay, and this image which represents all the nations, as we saw in the first or second part of our study, that has nothing to do with Russia but everything to do with Europe and those empires that we discussed. But they say no, they are all the same. And I want to suggest to you tonight that that is not the case. Okay, so just think about that for a moment. Okay, and this is what they also quote. Brother Thomas in Alpes Israel, the book where he discusses prophecy years and years ago, he says, and that is why, because the Christadelphians are all sitting on the edge of their seats, lots of them now, and there's quite a buzz going on. It says, when Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things are at present constituted is at hand. What is Brother Thomas? What did he believe? What did he say? He says Russia is going to be the power that makes this image stand again. And therefore, now that Russia's taking some extra land, the idea is, well, then next they must go and take more land or be in confederate with other nations so that this powerful sort of empire is existing again. So Russia is the one that makes the move, that gets all the nations lined up and together to go down. And when they get around Israel, Jesus comes and he does Armageddon. Everybody, am I making sense? It's easy to understand, but I could be explaining it badly. So give me a thumbs up. Hey, a wave there from Rwanda. Good. I'm really counting on you guys. Don't just give me a thumbs up to make me feel good. Give me a thumbs down if you're totally lost. Okay. So here's another quote that gives us that idea. But Thomas said, by turning to a map of Europe and Asia, the reader may trace out the territory of the kingdom of Babylon as it is destined to exist in the last form under the king of the north in his Gogian manifestation. That's kind of a long sentence and a lot of words just to mean that Russia is Gog, and they're gonna get all the nations together so that like the Babylonian Empire in those days will exist again. But if you know how small the Babylonian Empire was and the total empire of Rome, and that in the fourth beast in that image, these things don't make too much sense. Okay, so we will look at that now. But then he names a lot of countries. The countries furnished by Ezekiel will lead the reader to a just conception of its general extent. And then he says there's all the Russia, Sweden, Denmark, and he goes really names so many nations that it does seem like Russia just takes over the whole world. Okay, so notice here, this is out of the Gospel Truth Info Bible website from our Christadelphians, right? They say Armageddon. In Ezekiel 38, a great army from the north is described. If you look at the ancient maps of Ezekiel's day, you will see that all peoples mentioned come from the area of Russia, Central Europe, Iran, and parts of Africa. This confederacy of nations is to attack Israel, sparking off a great war, which will end with the return of Jesus to the earth. Okay. So just confirming what we understand from the normal Christadelphian view. There's only one big battle, Armageddon, to come, where Jesus will fight all the nations, and that is going to happen when Russia rounds up everybody, and there's this confederacy of nations, and they all go attack, and Jesus gets rid of them. Notice, though, a confederacy of nations. And in Ezekiel, it talks about that. It talks about, let's say, Gog is Russia, which I feel there is lots of solid proof for. It's not like the other empires that was shown in Daniel's image. An empire in Daniel's image is like Alexander the Great going and conquering territories, and all of that is his. In Ezekiel, Gog has not conquered all those territories. He's just in confederate with all those nations. So it's very different. So, I want you to keep that in mind, because it does make a difference. I'm leading you to a stage where you'll see that Ezekiel 38 is not part of those other prophecies that talk about Armageddon. And it's important, because if Russia is not going to bring about Armageddon, who's going to bring it about? and then when does Russia enter the picture? That is the whole idea that we're trying to see here. Okay, so just let's get back now to Daniel 2. We know that image. There's the image, and it was these beasts that represented empires. We all know that, and I don't know what's going on here. And then now we want to go to Ezekiel and look at those places in Ezekiel and place them on a map and see what is going on. So let's see. Okay. Now, for those of you who haven't been in the previous classes, let me try and explain what we are doing here. We are taking the Babylonian Empire and mapping it out on a map there in blue. It's very rough and ready, but it's not so far out, so nothing that can get us off into a wrong interpretation. The Greek Empire is the one that looks like a wrench, okay, the red one. The Medo-Persian Empire is the green one, and you can see it's all in this area here, and then the Romans came and they added all this part here to that whole image. So if we take the image of Daniel and we look at it geographically and leave the look at the countries they represented, then, and we know we should do that as we go over into Revelation. We even here in Ezekiel, we talk about countries. We got to figure out where they are, who they're talking about, and therefore, you know, then we will, I believe, make a more clear decision and come to a better conclusion. So if the image represented these empires and it has to stand again at the end, we first of all should say, well, that means all these countries should be involved again as to whatever power there is that represents this image. And it says in Revelation, stands for an hour, okay? So let's go and see if we can plot that. I'm going to take this part and plot it on this map where we're talking about Russia and Ukraine. So just to put you in the picture, here is Ukraine and Kiev is somewhere down here. Moscow is up here, about 2/3 up on this side of Russia. We have Turkey down here. So if we look at the image of Daniel 2, that's the area of the image of Daniel 2. So Ezekiel 38 is not talking about a time or someone that is establishing, like Brother Thomas says, that image empire again. It is calling on what I want to show you now in Ezekiel. The land of Magog. Where is the land of Magog? Because it says in Ezekiel, it's talking about a person who's the prince, the chief of the land of Magog. He's from the land of Magog, and he's the chief or the leader of Meshach and Tubal. So where's that? Well, people differ slightly. Some people have this area as this land of Magog, and other people say it's down here. I personally believe it's here, but even if it's down here, it's not going to matter, I promise you. The principle stays the same, because if you come from here, you are still coming from the north. But if you are of the leader who's getting all the confederacy of nations ready, but you are in this area, you are still going to come from the north to come down to Israel. You have, you know, that's the route they always come down to come and fight Israel. Okay, but let's say all the evidence is most probably that this is the land of Magog. Most historians agree with that. Look where Russia is, and Kiev, which is the actual origin of Russia, it's in the land of Magog. So the prince leader of the land, from the land of Magog, is most likely Russia. But here's the interesting point. We don't quite know where Meshach is. People say it's Moscow, but other people say, no, it's down here in Turkey. We also don't know where Tubal is. A lot of people say it's down here. Some say it's in Turkey. It's not going to make much of a difference, but at the moment, let's leave it as Moscow and Tubal is down here. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer. All right. And Togarmah is supposed, most people believe it is Turkey, but it talks about Togarmah and the other north part. So it could be right at the north here. What am I trying to show you? I'm trying to show you that this leader has a confederate of nations that is not even in this. Most of them are not even in this area, which is the image that has to be resurrected again as a one power. For some reason, we are expecting history to show us that all the countries in the Europe side here somehow is with these countries here all powerful in one. It talks about 10 nations giving their power to the beast to stand for 1 hour, if we're going to approach it that way. So it is interesting. Right. Now, I'm going to ask you to tell me interaction here again. If you can turn in your if you have your Bibles with you, let's turn to Ezekiel 38 again. And I want to ask you, do you think Ezekiel 38 and Zechariah 14 is the same event? I want a yes or no from you now. Very unfair question because you have never read it together. And you're going to guess or try and guess what I'd like you to say. So think about that. Do you think that is the traditional view, that Ezekiel 38 and Zechariah 14 is the same? It's the same event. Right? Because they've got all those prophecies listed as our Armageddon time. So I asked myself this question, and then I just went and I said, okay, what I'll do is I'll dot down the one and dot down the other one on the right. And then let's just see what comes up. And if they look the same, they are the same or not. Okay, so I see Liana's always smiling. That makes me nervous. But anyway, yeah, she's so pretty there. She's even more pretty on screen now. Anyway, I'm getting distracted here. Okay, they're not the same. Yeah, Liana, maybe you peeped at my study. I don't know. Anyway. Okay, so in Ezekiel 38, it says, verse 8, after it said, speak to the chief leader of the land of from Magog, leader of Meshach and Tubal, and it mentions all those nations. It says it will happen in the latter years. Now, latter years is open for interpretation, right? It could mean the days and the years just before Jesus returns, but there's another meaning to it as well, which I'll show you later. Verse 16 is interesting. God says, you have come against my land in the latter days, right? So it's interesting that God refers to Israel now as my land. And you, in the scriptures, you'll find that God says to Israel, because you defiled the land, I'm chasing you out. And there's a strong theme in the Bible that God says, while you are like you are now, Israel, like they are at the moment, it's not really his land anymore, in the sense that when Jesus comes and he restores Israel to be a holy nation and he's king there, then in effect, it's God's land again. At the time, at this moment, it's the time of the Gentiles. And, strictly, technically speaking, you can kind of see why God says in Ezekiel, I'll show you now why he says my land and not, there's a reason for that. Okay. Verse 17, he says to, interesting enough, to go, you're coming down, and this was spoken of before by other prophets. So we need to go and do some homework as to where else in the Bible do we read about the Gogian sort of invasion. I'm very shallow or wanting for information there yet. Verse 18, notice God is extremely furious. He is. It's interesting in this book, Ezekiel. He is very, very, very angry with Gog. Okay, and he says that when Gog comes down and he destroys Gog, there will be a shaking in Israel. The animals and the men will shake. There's this idea of shaking, very interesting theme to follow through on other prophecies. The mountains are thrown down. All the steep places and the walls fall. Gog goes sword against sword. All these nations, they start fighting each other, right? In all the mountains of Israel. Where's all this fighting going on? I want to answer from you. Does this seem to you like it's in the valley of Jehoshaphat or all over the rural countryside of Israel? Where do you think it is? Come, we have to put on our thinking caps tonight. I might have a prize for the most answers. No, we'll rather not do that. Okay. I suggest to you, if you read Ezekiel 38, yeah?
Sorry, we were just asking you to repeat your question again, please.
This fighting, when Gog comes down with all the nations in Ezekiel 38, what does the language give us idea there? Why are mountains thrown down? And steep places fall and walls fall, and it says the nations will start fighting us in all the mountains of Israel. Does that give you an idea that this fighting is going on just in the valley of Jehoshaphat, or is it going on somewhere out in Israel, a bit further away from Jerusalem, as Gog is coming down to try and take Jerusalem? What would you think? While you're thinking about this, I want you to also note something, that when people speak about this prophecy, they focus on Gog, and then they go to all the other prophecies and they just run the curriculum like we've been taught for ages, and there's not much of this in-depth looking at each little bit of information and teasing it out and making sure we know what's going on. And therefore you must be very careful. And you know, the more you know, you can listen to things and then actually see where there might be a place something has gone wrong.
Lucas, Brother Mickey here.
Yep.
In Israel, isn't the northern parts much more mountainous than the southern part, and Jerusalem is more to the south?
I do think so, yeah. That's a good point. Okay, it sounds like all over Israel. Thanks, Patricia. First and best fighting doesn't seem localized in Ezekiel. Yes, so yeah, you guys, you know, the point is these things are actually straightforward, but if we don't look at them and you just hear things given to you in all kinds of fancy style, then sometimes, you know, you miss some things. Okay, great. I'm happy we're making all good sense. Okay. So the fighting in Israel is in Israel land before Gog gets to Jerusalem. So already there we should see this is not Armageddon. Okay, God sends pestilence, blood, he rains fire and brimstone and hailstones on them in verse 22. Gog is destroyed by natural forces and they fight against themselves. But notice, yes, very important now. I want you to notice this. There are no war battles in this fight. There are nobody in Israel going out and have to fight those nations. There's no Jesus have to go out and fight those nations. Jerusalem is never mentioned. Right? This Ezekiel is so different from these Armageddon prophecies, and yet we say, no, this is Armageddon and so on. But the way this enemy is destroyed is they fight against each other and God just sends all the hailstones and sorts out Gog. By the way, in the end of Revelation, Gog appears again. And if you believe like I do that Gog, there's two different times Gog appears, in the beginning of Revelation and in the end. In the end, what God does, he destroys Gog in a different way. That day, that last time, at the end of the 1,000 years, God does what Elijah did when those troops came to him. He just takes them out with, zaps them with like fire and just, they're gone, boom. So they fight each other and there's hail and the nature kills them. But right at the end, God's going to just wipe them out once, like with a click of a finger, sort of, with all his might and power. Anyway, here we are. No war, no battles. Jerusalem is never mentioned. Now, notice what do we get in, something quite different in Zechariah 14. It says, it talks of the day of the Lord. And I believe if you carefully look in the Bible at the day of the Lord, it means the day Jesus comes back. All nations go to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, you see, is mentioned a lot. The city is taken, houses destroyed, women ravished, half of them go into captivity. The Lord Yahweh fights against those nations. And what is interesting here, it says, we know from later, as you'll see in this chapter, it's really Jesus on God's behalf, but he comes in the name of Yahweh of hosts. He's the authority from God to do the fighting, but it's God doing all the fighting. But it says there, as when he fought in the day of battle. So we need to ask ourselves, what history is referred to here? Where before did this kind of thing happen? Because it says, when in that day, when Jesus, you'll see in the verses later, goes out and fights the enemies round about, Armageddon, that kind of thing had a pattern before in the Bible. Okay, and I'll show you where it happened. There's a very good pattern with David in his life. Okay, so Jesus returns. It says, verse 4, there is no one that will dispute this. It's absolutely clear that Zechariah 14 talks about Jesus. His feet is on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives will split in two. There's an earthquake. And then the Jews flee. At that time when Jesus returns and the Jews are going to flee, there's no safety there or ideas of dwelling safely. In Ezekiel 38, it says, go comes down because Israel is dwelling safely. Right now, there's no safety in Zechariah 14. Then it says Jesus comes with the saints. The days are not light nor dark because of the fighting and so on. And then living waters will go from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, summer and winter. Okay. It just shows you there will be when Jesus comes, what the situation is and what it turns to, right? At the moment, water is a big issue for Israel. It's scarce, and they're very good at getting it into their country and so on. But this talks about a time when there's just abundance of water. It goes, even the Dead Sea becomes alive again, and it's there all the time, summer and winter. There's just no shortage of water, and it's just a great place to be because Jesus came back and he sorted out all the enemies round about. Jesus rules in verse 9, and notice after the result of this is Jesus will rule and there will be no more utter destruction. It says in verse 11, Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. So you're getting the idea that Zechariah must happen first, and when the safety is there, then Ezekiel 38 comes into play. And therefore it's quite important not to make the two the same. Notice a few verses further. How is the enemy destroyed in Zechariah 14? Right, there comes in verse 12, this plague, all flesh is consumed away. It talks of something like a nuclear war. Their eyes will just rot out of their heads and their flesh will just be consumed away. So you can see that whatever the plague is, it's going to have the effect that as if a nuclear explosion was on the earth. The only similarity I find slightly is that nations are terrified and they fight each other. But notice, just because there is one war going on here and the nations, your enemy, turns on each other and fight each other, doesn't mean to say that that's the same event when it could happen here as well, which it does. Although the same thing happens in both cases, it doesn't make it the same event. Okay, it's not enough. It's quite possible that there are two events that have a few similar things in them. Okay, notice here's war battles going on. Verse 14, Judah fights. Judah goes, the Israelites go and fight. Jesus goes out and fights his enemies like the days of old, like he did in the past, like David did. Okay. And they take the wealth of the nations, and it says the wealth of the heathen round about is taken, gold, silver, and clothing. And I want you to make a note that when it says all nations, it doesn't mean each and every nation in the world. That can very likely also and very plausibly refer to mainly the nations round about Israel, the immediate enemies, the Arab nations now, round about Israel, and whoever other nations come there in those territories to fight and help them. So they will all come down, and who knows, even when the Roman Empire came down to fight and take Israel in the old days, in that army there were people from Rome, but there were also Arabian people and so on. So the mix of the all nations can be a mix of nations, but the locality where it will be is the nations round about, those Arab nations. Those are the people who are going to be really gathered there, and Jesus comes and destroys them and takes all the gold, silver, clothing. Interesting enough, he will also then have control of the oil in the Arab nations and so on. Right. Then the plague of verse 12 is also on the animals, it says in verse 15. And what is the result of this? The result is that all nations fighting must come to Jerusalem once a year to worship Jesus and have the Feast of Tabernacles. Now ask yourself, when Jesus makes this peace, he now says every nation must come and keep the Feast of Tabernacles and come to Jerusalem once a year, a pilgrimage. The Arab nations are so used to pilgrimage. It's going to be very applicable to those nations round about. But do you think it's so applicable to America, to get the Americans to come right over and come and, come worship? They might have to. And what do they know about the Feast of Tabernacles? Maybe, Christian people know about it, but definitely verse 16 is very applicable to the Arab nations. They know all these things, and they will come and do these things. It tells you, though, that Jerusalem is a very safe place to go to. Jesus has cleared all the animosity. Even today, if you want to go to Israel, you're a bit apprehensive because you know they might fire some missiles there. You don't want to be in the wrong place. But the result of Zechariah is Jesus comes, fights, Armageddon takes place, and there is safety. Now notice Psalm 118, verse 10 and 11. David said, all nations compassed me about. Those all nations were not every nation in the world. It was in David's time, all these nations round about, the Arab nations, that be the Edomites and the Moabites and people from Gaza, and the Philistines, Arabs. All my enemies round about me, the Arabs they compass me about, but in the name of Yahweh will I destroy them. Jesus says, when I come back, people will say, blessed is he that comes in the name of Yahweh. They compassed me about, yea, they compassed me about, but in the name of God, I will destroy them. Of Yahweh, I will destroy them. And that's what it says when it says, I will go in the previous verses, I'll go out and fight like of the days of old. This is one example. David, you must go, make a note of this, please. Go and read Psalm 118 and see in the end verses there how applicable, prophetic this psalm is of Jesus being in Jerusalem and saying, I'm surrounded now by all these Arab enemies, and that's my goal. I'm coming here to sort it out and make peace with them. And it will be destroying all the nations in Armageddon, and then there will be peace. Just like David did, and he could hand over the kingdom to Solomon, and Solomon had rest, like it says in Ezekiel 38, from all his enemies round about. All right. So can I have some kind of idea who of you do believe that it's not the same event? or from what you see here, you can see that it's not the same event. If you want to disagree with me, I'm not going to fight with you. I'll just make a note and come and bomb your house, Putin style. Okay. Does this make sense? Yes.
I believe it's not the same, just because when we read Isaiah 65, verse 17 and 18, and then we compare with what is happening now and the Armageddon, doesn't add up.
Okay.
That's because in Isaiah says, I will make everything new. Everything that has been happening is going to be forgotten.
Yes.
Now, Armageddon will come after Jesus has come.
After what has come?
When Jesus has arrived, then we'll have Armageddon.
And that's why we also, and that's why these two are two different events.
Okay.
The one follows the other one.
Okay. So Luana, Stacey, and Charles says not the same event. Liesel says looks different. Furstenberg, seeing it side by side really helps clarify. Great. And then Kenyon Toomey says it looks different to us. Fantastic. Okay. So I do believe we come to the same conclusion. Okay. I'll give you some more ideas to prove this. Here is the map that just shows these countries of Gog from the land of Gog. Turkey, if Togarmah and Meshech and Tubal is in there, and then Persia, Sudan, Ethiopia, it's actually Ethiopia down here, and Libya, right? Those nations. And then higher up, we saw from the earlier map, we've got Gog and Gomer up there. Okay, so those countries are the confederate. It's not this image of Daniel. It's a confederate outer ring of countries. Now, the person who did this talk on the internet does say something very interesting. He says, isn't this a bizarre prediction that when it says go, you're going to get some countries together and come and down and attack Israel, it mentions none of these countries who are the worst enemies of Israel. They want to take them out every day. Nothing of them is mentioned. Look at Israel today. All these countries in red, if they could take out Israel right now, they would be there and do it. They are trying to do it. Now, you would think if Gog said to these countries, listen, let's go and take out Israel, that all these nations here would be there in a jiffy, like in a split second. Why would they not jump at the chance to join this confederacy and say, you are coming to do what we would have wanted to do for ages already, so let's just all go? No, there is this idea that there's this inner ring of countries, Arab countries, that Jesus comes back and something is triggered that he will come and save them from those countries. And now this is a safe space. It's a great place where people must come to worship once a year, otherwise they won't get rain. And Israel dwells safely without walls, without fences, and now people can come there. That is not the case today. You won't be able to go there to worship or ask anybody just to come and to worship. All right. So here we're getting close to the end now. So here is what, the usual explanation is. We have all these prophecies, Ezekiel 38 as well. And like we saw, Brother Thomas quoted, Gog builds the image empire. Jesus returns to defeat Gog and all these nations, and he sets up his kingdom. And all these prophecies are talking of the same thing, which I'm trying to prove to you it's not. The result of seeing prophecy this way goes like this. There are no other important players or events to trigger the return of Jesus. Right? We're just waiting. Therefore, you can see why the Christians, a lot of them are now so excited, because they say, oh, this start, if Russia takes Ukraine, then that could be the start. Then they might take a next nation, and that escalates into that, and then eventually they go for Israel. Right. But that's not what we see what happens. So what I'm going to suggest to you is there's a slight modification that we need when we look at prophecy, and it's this. We need to take out Ezekiel 38 from that Armageddon prophecies and say, yes, these ones, you can go read them. They all talk about, like Zechariah 14, Jesus comes back to save Israel from the nations round about in that valley, and there'll be other nations involved, but it's all, if you want to attack Israel, you are round about there and on their borders, like at the moment, there's no real peace, right? So now Christ returns to save Israel from Arab enemies, the nations round about Israel. Then there's true peace and Israel dwells safely. In part 2, we did this extensively to prove that if you read from Ezekiel 34 all the way to 38, you will clearly see that this is all a time, Ezekiel 38 is a time when Israel has been brought back from the sword. They've been saved. They're the holy nation. The dry bones have happened. The prophecy where they a holy nation again. And Jesus is already in the earth. Then we have Ezekiel 38, where those outer ring of nations are confederate with Russia most probably, and they try to invade Israel, but God destroys them. Okay, so that means for us, and I think this is my last slide, Liesel. Where's Liesel? Okay, the baby is keeping a company. Anyway, what we should be looking out for is an image of Daniel 2 to stand again for an hour with 10 kings. We support in Revelation, the two beasts after they kill the harlot, which is called Babylon. So there's a lot of detail there, but those kind of things still have to happen. There needs to be a time of tribulation. There's no buying or selling the Antichrist. Isn't it interesting that this the Bible talks about these things of the Antichrist, and what he will do is very similar to the king Nebuchadnezzar, forcing people to worship the image. And in Revelation 13, there are these two beasts. One of them is the Antichrist. And if we see prophecy this way, we will get ourselves more ready for some other difficult times that will arise for us and that we have to navigate and go through. But these things are very close now, because if Russia is already in such a good space politically to fulfill the Ezekiel 38 role, we should know that these things are also not too long to wait for. But I believe, I personally believe Russia will either take Ukraine and it will get its sovereignty a bit more back. And then later on, when the Arab-Jewish Armageddon has taken place, then they will come down for the reason of taking the spoil. What the land is then in terms of riches, as to when Jesus has taken it back and there's peace there. So, there is a very important change of emphasis as to what we should be looking at in the world. At the moment, with the normal interpretation of prophecy, the focus is all way much more and too much on Russia. And every time Russia makes a move or sneezes, everybody thinks this is the time of Christ arising or returning. And I believe there's quite a few other things that has to happen. And then we will eventually get to Ezekiel 38. Right, so I'm gonna, that is the end of the class. You're most welcome for input and tell me what you might be thinking about all of this.
I'm not speaking.